Eastern Airlines Flight 66 is flying from New Orleans to New York and is on short final to JFK International Airport. All seems normal until it is not.
Terrain. Pull up.
This is NBC Nightly News, Tuesday, June 24th, with John Chancellor.
Good evening. More than 100 people were reported dead in a plane crash near New York's Kennedy Airport this afternoon. Eastern Flight 66 was on what appeared to be a normal approach when it either exploded in the air or dove into the ground. Accounts differ. It was raining heavily at the time. When the plane hit the ground, parts of it skidded across a highway filled with rush hour traffic, smashing cars.
June 24th, 1975, New Orleans International Airport. Eastern Airlines Flight 66 is about to embark on a routinely scheduled domestic flight between Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport and New York JFK International Airport. Eastern Airlines Flight 66 was operating using a Boeing 727 tri-jet, and it held 124 people on this particular flight. The flight crew consisted of 4 people. The captain was 54-year-old John W. Clevin, who had been serving with Eastern Airlines for nearly 25 years and had been a 727 captain since July 10, 1968. Clevin had a total of 17,381 flight hours, including 2,813 hours on the Boeing 727. The first officer was 34-year-old William Eberhardt, who had been serving with Eastern Airlines for nearly 9 years. He had 5,063 flight hours, of which 4,327 were on the Boeing 727. The flight engineer was 31-year-old Gary M. Guerin, who had been with Eastern Airlines since 1968 and had 3,910 flight hours, 3,123 of which were on the Boeing 727. The second flight engineer, 33-year-old Peter J. McCullough, had been with Eastern Airlines for 4 years and had 3,602 military flying hours and 1,767 civilian flight hours, including 676 hours on the Boeing 727. He was administering a required flight check on Guerin. The flight took off from New Orleans at 1:19 p.m. and headed northeast towards New York, and it was smooth sailing for most of the flight with fair weather. Meanwhile, though, in the New York area, the same could not be said. What was a quiet early afternoon has evolved into a noisy one, with scattered showers and thunderstorms developing in the area. And as Eastern 66 approaches the New York area, so did a severe thunderstorm. At 3:35, the crew was instructed to contact the JFK approach controller for instructions, and the approach controller sequenced it into an approach pattern for runway 22 left. At 3:52, the approach controller warned all incoming aircraft that the airport was experiencing, quote, very light rain and haze and near zero visibility, and all aircraft must use instrument flight rules. Instrument flight rules are one of the 2 methods to operate an aircraft, with the other being visual flight rules. The crew was obviously instructed to use instrument flight rules due to there being no visibility for visual flight rules. At 3:53, Flight 66 was switched to another frequency for final preparations to land. The controllers also sent the crew directions to operate around the thunderstorms and sequence it into a landing pattern with the other aircraft. At this same time, and because of the worsening weather conditions, one of the crew members checked the weather at LaGuardia Airport, which was the flight's alternate airport. Also at this same time, there was 4 other aircraft in front of Eastern 66 in line to land. Those planes were Flying Tiger Line 161, Eastern 902, Finnair 105, and a Beech Baron. At 3:56, the first plane in line, Flying Tiger Flight 161, landed safely and reported his observations to air traffic control.
Flying Tiger 161.
Tiger 161, right turn cross 31 left.
Roger that, but I highly recommend that you change the runways and land northwest. You have such tremendous wind shear down near the ground on final.
Okay, we're indicating wind right down the runway at 15 knots when you landed.
I don't care what you're indicating, I'm just telling you that there's such a wind shear on the final on that runway that you should change it to the northwest.
Ideally, you want airplanes to take off and land directly into a headwind because it will generate the most amount of lift for the plane. You do not want to land in a crosswind because it can be extremely unpredictable and dangerous. This is the reason that the captain of Flying Tiger 161 highly recommended that the airport change which runways the planes would be landing at. However, the conditions that Flying Tiger 161 experienced and the information that air traffic control received were different, and they did not change the runways. The next plane in line to land was Eastern 902. Eastern 902 attempted to land but ultimately abandoned this attempt and opted to go around due to the harsh weather conditions. As they re-established communications with air traffic control, they made very clear the terrible conditions that they just encountered.
Eastern 902, we're turning to 140, and we had pretty good shear pulling us to the right and down, and visibility was nil out over the marker. Correction. At about 200 feet, it was nothing.
Okay, the shear say pulled you right and down?
Yeah, we were off course and down to about 250 feet.
At 3:59, the controller warned all incoming aircraft of a severe wind shift on final approach and advised that more information would be transmitted shortly. And although communications on the frequency continued to report worsening weather conditions, Flight 66 decided to continue its approach to runway 22 left. At this same time, the captain of Eastern 66, while listening to what other planes ahead of him were reporting, remarked,
You know this is asinine.
to which an unidentified crew member said,
I wonder if they're covering for themselves.
Air traffic control then said,
Eastern 66, turn left, heading 220. Did you copy that, sir?
to which they replied,
Affirmative.
Okay, Eastern 66, 5 miles from the outer marker. Cleared ILS runway, 22 left approach.
Okay, we'll let you know about the conditions.
After this, the other two aircraft that were in front of Eastern 66 landed without incident, even though they also experienced the same poor weather conditions.
I'm gonna keep a pretty healthy margin on this one. I would suggest that you do, in case he's right.
Eastern 66 contact, JFK approach for landing clearance.
30 degrees of flaps, please.
Eastern 66, you are cleared to land runway, 22 left.
Got any reports on the braking action on the runway? 1,000 feet.
No, none. Approach end of the runway is wet, but I'd say the first half is wet. We've had no adverse reports.
500 feet. Stay on the gauges. Oh yes, I'm right with it. 3 green, 30 degrees, final checklist. Right. I have the approach lights. Okay. Stay on the gauges. I'm with it.
Eastern 66 and National 1004. The only adverse reports we've had about the approach is wind shear on short final.
Runway in sight. I got it. Got it? Damn! Take off thrust!
This is NBC Nightly News, Tuesday, June 24th, with John Chancellor.
Good evening. More than 100 people were reported dead in a plane crash near New York's Kennedy Airport this afternoon. Eastern Flight 66 was on what appeared to be a normal approach when it either exploded in the air or dove into the ground. Accounts differ. It was raining heavily at the time. When the plane hit the ground, parts of it skidded across a highway filled with rush hour traffic, smashing cars.
Of the 124 people on board, only 11 survived, making this the single deadliest plane crash in the United States to that point. Immediately after the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, was dispatched to try and find out why the plane crashed. The NTSB knew almost immediately that the weather was more than likely the cause of the crash, but the exact extent was unknown. They studied the weather, interviewed pilots and witnesses, and thoroughly analyzed the wreckage. They initially came to the conclusion that although the weather played a factor in the crash, it was fairly normal thunderstorm activity, thus placing a majority of the blame on pilot error. At this point, Eastern Airlines caught wind of the way the investigation was going, and they were not satisfied with the blame being placed on their pilots. So they decided to ask a meteorologist to conduct an independent investigation to see if they found any different conclusions. And the meteorologist that they asked was none other than Ted Fujita, a world-renowned tornado scientist. Fujita, who had come to the US from Japan 22 years prior, was one of the top meteorologists in the country. Fujita had done significant research on multiple tornadoes over the last 2 decades, and was most famous for the extensive research that he had conducted of the 1974 super outbreak the year prior. Fujita immediately went to work and studied all the same things that the NTSB did. And after studying all available outlets, he came to a different conclusion. He theorized that what slammed Eastern 66 into the ground was a massive downdraft of air that came out of the thunderstorm, which he termed a microburst. Fujita theorized that these microbursts existed based off of two experiences in his past. The first was in his native Japan in 1945. On August 9, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, Japan, leaving complete devastation in its wake. About a month later, Fujita and his team were asked to try and determine exactly where and at what height the bomb was detonated. The team concluded that the bomb exploded roughly 1,700 feet in the air, or 520 meters. What interests Fujita more, though, was the pattern of the debris left by the bomb. He noticed that the trees directly under the blast site remained standing, while all others radiating out from ground zero fell away horizontally in a starburst pattern. He soon realized that the air from the bomb descended rapidly where it struck the ground and fanned out in all directions. Fast forward 29 years to the 1974 super outbreak. While observing the damage from the air, Fujita noticed something very familiar in the damage, a starburst pattern in the fallen trees. However, this time it wasn't from a bomb, it was from a thunderstorm. This observation would lead him to believe that thunderstorms could produce some sort of violent downdraft of air that would hit the ground and spread out in all directions, which leads us back to the plane crash that happened 1 year later in 1975. Fujita proposed that a microburst was the cause of the crash of Eastern 66, as well as numerous other mysterious plane crashes in the past. He also proposed that although extremely powerful, these microbursts were so short-lived that by the time the next aircraft flew through the same area, it was gone. The NTSB reluctantly agreed with Fujita's new theory and changed the number one cause of the plane crash back to the weather that was at play that day. The NTSB recommended in their final paper that ground-based sensor systems that can detect wind shear should be developed and installed at airports around the world. And as a result, the FAA helped develop the Low-Level Wind Shear Alert System, which was a network of anemometers surrounding an airport that can detect divergent wind directions and velocities and sound a wind shear alarm in the control tower. And by 1977, just 2 years after the crash at JFK, the system was already being installed at major airports across the United States. While this was a big step in improving air travel safety, it would prove to not be enough. Despite the findings of the Eastern 66 crash, the aviation community was not very accepting of Fujita's theory. They still held true to the theory that there was no wind event strong enough that could actually bring down a plane. They also cited that there was no physical proof that microbursts even existed. So other than the addition of the low-level wind shear alert system, nothing was really done, and that would prove costly. Fujita, meanwhile, decided to try and prove once and for all that microbursts did exist. He theorized that the recently developed Doppler radar technology could prove his theory and detect microbursts. So, in the summer of 1978, Fujita organized 3 extensive experiments in the Midwest in hopes of finding evidence of microbursts. For weeks, though, he came up empty-handed. Then, on May 29, 1978, that all changed. On that day, while he was operating the Doppler radar, a microburst formed and slammed down directly on their site. Not only did Fujita finally collect the data on a microburst that he sought for years, but he actually survived the microburst. Over the course of the next 8 years, Fujita's research would document hundreds of microbursts. Although Fujita was making significant strides on his microburst research, the aviation community continued to neglect his findings, and that would prove fatal shortly. July 9, 1982. New Orleans International Airport. Pan Am Flight 759 is about to take off from Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport en route for Las Vegas. The current weather in the area? Thunderstorms. Although there are thunderstorms in the area, there's no obvious cause for concern and the flight is set to continue as planned. At 4:07 p.m., Flight 759 began its takeoff roll on runway 10. The plane left the ground without any issues, but almost immediately started fighting an invisible force. Flight 759 lifted off the runway and climbed to an altitude between 95 and 150 feet, and then began to descend. About 2,376 feet from the end of the runway, the aircraft struck a line of trees at an altitude of about 50 feet. The aircraft continued descending for another 2,234 feet, hitting more trees and houses. At 4:09 p.m., the aircraft crashed into the residential area of Kenner, about 4,610 feet from the end of the runway. All 145 passengers and crew, along with 8 others on the ground, perished. The NTSB once again was dispatched to the scene to try and find out what caused the crash. They immediately noticed many similarities to the Eastern 66 crash from 7 years prior. After conducting their thorough investigation, they concluded that the most likely cause of the crash was a microburst that slammed the plane into the ground. To make matters even worse, a wind shear alert was mentioned on New Orleans airport radio frequencies on July 9th, before Flight 759 took off. But the flight crew had been briefed with weather information that was 2 hours old, even though it was airport routine to have hourly weather updates. And there was also no policy at the airport at the time for advising flight crews that updated weather information was available. So due to all the information that Pan Am 759 didn't know, they decided to take off in the adverse weather, which would cost them their lives. So, once again, another plane had gone down due to a microburst, and still no major changes were made to the system, which would once again prove fatal 3 years later. August 2nd, 1985. Delta 191 is a routine flight from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to Dallas, Texas, and is getting prepared to land. The crew of Delta 191 has been notified about thunderstorm activity around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. As the plane got into position to land, the thunderstorms continued to intensify around the airport. The captain of Delta 191 was a cautious pilot and tried to avoid flying through thunderstorms if he could, but this one was right over the airport, so he had no choice. As the plane was on short final, it flew into said thunderstorm and unknowingly another microburst. The microburst hammered the aircraft towards the ground, and the flight crew actually noticed it slightly beforehand, but it was still too late. The microburst rocked the plane and pushed it downward until it made contact with the ground about 6,300 feet short of the runway. The plane actually came down at a shallow enough of an angle that it didn't crash immediately, and instead drove on the ground since its landing gear was down. The plane crossed Highway 114 and hit a car, killing the driver instantly. Meanwhile, the plane kept speeding on the ground at 200 miles per hour before it finally crashed into 2 water tanks on the edge of the airport and burst into flames. The crash killed a total of 137 people, including the man whose car was struck by the plane on the highway. And once again, the NTSB arrived at the crash scene and fairly quickly ruled that another microburst was the likely cause of the crash. This crash was the final straw and turning point, though, for the aviation community, as this was the 3rd microburst-related crash in the last 10 years. The crash of Delta 191 was the tipping point that finally prompted the aviation community to reevaluate and ultimately accept Fujita's theory on microbursts. And shortly after the crash, research finally began on microburst detection and avoidance systems. Soon thereafter, the FAA decided that it would be in their best interest if they were to install the new Doppler radar technology at all airports across the country. This was also the same system that Ted Fujita had been using to conduct his research and be able to see microbursts as they happen. This was a great step, but it wasn't quite enough, as the warning from these ground-based radars wouldn't always reach the pilots in time. Planes currently had weather radar on board, but it was a different system and it couldn't detect microbursts. NASA soon thereafter began developing a new system that would be able to see and warn pilots of incoming microbursts. They figured that the best way to conduct research and develop this new system was to actually attempt to fly through microbursts themselves and collect data. So, in the summer of 1991, they modified a Boeing 737 and did just that. The NASA researchers were testing 3 separate systems and seeing which was most effective. The 3 systems were a modified Doppler radar housed in the plane's nose, a laser radar under the plane's cargo bay, and an infrared device mounted on the side which could measure changes in air temperature. Each of these systems was wired to a bank of computers within the plane. Spotters located on the ground were able to find microbursts and quickly direct the plane so that they could fly through it. The research team flew through dozens of microbursts, and the research proved that only the Doppler radar in the plane's nose consistently gave pilots enough of a warning of the microburst ahead. After NASA concluded its research, the FAA quickly certified the use of the Doppler-based warning system, and shortly after, the nose-based warning systems were placed on all aircraft. Along with all of this, pilots were now required to train to react to microbursts and quickly take evasive actions in order to safely land the plane. It took over a decade, but the aviation community finally took Ted Fujita's theory seriously and implemented all of these safety measures, which would undoubtedly save lives in the future. Before all of these safety measures were added, there were dozens of microburst-related plane crashes, and in the 30-plus years since then, there has only been one. The crash of Eastern 66 was the beginning of a turning point in aviation that would be a slow and painful one, but ultimately would go on to change aviation forever.